It's easy to look at a roller coaster and think to yourself, it's just a thrill ride. But no, it's much more than that. A roller coaster is oftentimes not just a vessel for thrills, but works as an art piece. In the same way that cities are defined by the architecture and monuments that make up their skylines, so too do amusement and theme parks use them to define their landscapes. A well-constructed coaster, using various elements not just creatively but thoughtfully to provide an exceptional experience, can only be crafted by a talented artist. Beyond even that, many coasters work to take a concept and make it abstract, conveying ideas and emotions through the movement along the track. At its pinnacle, the roller coaster works as a vehicle for storytelling, using various methods and theming to achieve a narrative. Today we're going to be taking a look at the art of the roller coaster, breaking down the various ways it manifests not just as entertainment, but as an incredibly intense expression of art. San Francisco. When I mention the name of the city, what comes to mind? Perhaps it might be the food or the culture, but there's a strong chance that you're picturing the landmarks that define your internal interpretation of this cityscape. It's possible they might be thinking about the Painted Ladies, a row of iconic Victorian and Edwardian houses painted in bright colors. It's possible they may be picturing many of the city's iconic skyscrapers. Perhaps it might be Alcatraz Island, or the vivid Golden Gate Bridge. The architecture and landmarks that make up cities are important components of their identities, especially when taken into context with the landscapes that they're built upon. When you're visiting a city as a tourist, you're not just there for the attractions and activities, but to appreciate the urban aesthetic. In the same way that we can marvel at the iconic Eiffel Tower, acting as an exciting visual beacon over the streets of Paris, so too can we appreciate the impressive feat of engineering that is the roller coaster, acting as a visual draw and defining the landscape of its respective park. Here we find ourselves at Cedar Point, following Gatekeeper, an impressive B&M wing coaster model. In a park defined by a mass of wooden and steel structures, Gatekeeper stands out just a bit more visually, especially as it flies through its towers that flank the entrance to the park. From the moment guests enter the parking lot, the train roaring through this steel behemoth leaves a powerful impression through visual awe. Cedar Point is not a particularly beautiful park, but its skyline is defined by twisted steel, a powerful aesthetic on its own. I believe that people are quick to dismiss this particular visual appeal of roller coasters because many perceive them as just amusements. But why then would we consider something like the Gateway Arch of St. Louis an iconic example of significant architecture? It's not quite the same, but that visually impressive mass of steel that is the roller coaster will absolutely dominate an environment through its imposing structure. A well-constructed roller coaster, conveying excitement and power just through structure alone, is in itself artistic. Not all coasters state their presence by looming over the viewer, though. Some of the best track layouts make their impression by not just utilizing their elements to create a great ride, but also by creating an entrancing visual spectacle as well. Appropriately named Kumba, which means roar, this B&M sit-down coaster at Busch Gardens, Tampa, impresses guests from down on the ground as the ride weaves throughout the Congo-themed area. From the bridge, the trains roar by as they subject the guests to the forces of this visually impressive cobra roll. Later in the ride course, the track hugs the ground, sending riders through Kumba's most iconic element, the interlocking corkscrews. Many elements aren't just great when used well and thoughtfully in the ride course, but they become even better when they enhance the coaster visually. A few other nearby examples would be at Islands of Adventure with the Incredible Hulk and the newly opened Velocicoaster. Hulk is another B&M sit-down, but competes with Kumba as a visual spectacle, launching riders out of a tube and into a series of inversions. On the other hand, the Velocicoaster is an Intamin launched steel coaster that focuses on negative Gs and airtime, yet surpasses even the Hulk in its impressive visual elements. It's incredibly cool to pass under the 0G stall as the train flies by, or to be standing outside in the queue next to the roll over the water. Another strength of the Velocicoaster is the first half, launching riders into a spaghetti bowl through the Raptor paddock. While actual theming elements are rather sparse because it's mostly plants and rockwork, the way that the coaster moves through this portion was designed with visual appeal in mind. The level of planning that has to go into creating an experience that is not just great on its own, but also works as an enticing spectacle, must be the work of an artist. Some parks take this even further by having their coasters run through impressively themed landscapes. Two that immediately come to mind are Fly and Terran at Phantasialand, which I recently just covered in another video. Fly moves through the steampunk city streets of an area called Rookburg, and Terran winds throughout the foreboding Nordic village of Klugheim. Of course, we would be missing out if I didn't mention the well-constructed landscapes of certain Disney coasters, such as Seven Dwarfs Mine Train or Big Thunder Mountain. It's one thing to seek out a coaster for its thrill element, but what we cannot deny is their visual appeal. Ranging from the intimidating twisted steel that defines many skylines, to the labyrinths of wood shaking with fury, to the impressive landscapes and visual showmanship of themed experiences, the artistic visual nature of the roller coaster is an inherent component of its appeal. The earliest roller coasters naturally lacked the complexity and scale that we're used to today. Built purely for thrill, the earliest wooden roller coasters were simply designed to be functional. For example, the oldest operating coaster in the world is Leap the Dips, located at Lakemont Park. Constructed in 1902, the track is shaped like a figure 8, with its thrill coming from the short dips found throughout, and the lateral G-forces on the curving track. However, as technology advanced and builders became more experienced, wooden coasters have become larger and more complex, focusing heavily not just on lateral Gs, but also airtime and speed. A well-constructed wooden coaster can't throw in too many complex elements, but there's still an art to perfecting the right pacing and thrill. Of course, as technology has advanced, we've seen steel added to the wooden structures in many novel ways. The Son of Beast at Kings Island was the first roller coaster to feature a vertical loop in 2000. But elements like this have really only existed as a novelty gimmick. The only player truly changing the game for steel integration is Rocky Mountain Construction, or RMC. Six Flags took a chance, allowing them to convert a traditional wooden coaster called Texas Giant into New Texas Giant in 2011, integrating their steel I-box track into a modified wooden structure. While New Texas Giant worked as a proof of concept, RMC coasters would continue to become more complex, adding in more extreme elements and even multiple inversions, putting them on par with many steel coasters in regards to experience and pacing. Speaking of which, the earliest steel coasters were very much in the same vein as early wooden coasters, built to be functional, but this time with novelty elements, like inversions. The first major steel coaster to feature an inversion was Corkscrew, developed by Arrow and installed at Knott's Berry Farm in 1975. The following year, the first major steel roller coaster to feature a vertical loop would be the Great American Revolution, located at Six Flags Magic Mountain. Manufactured by Schwarzkopf, you can see that the novelty and thrill of the vertical loop took precedence over the pacing of the ride experience. However, just as the wooden coaster evolved to convey a well-paced sensory experience through motion, so too did the steel coaster. As new types of inversions and track elements have been made possible through advancing technology and imagination, the steel coaster has evolved to become a different type of sensory experience, but still just as inherently artistic as their wooden counterparts. For the average person, they may just see a roller coaster and think to themselves, well, it looks intense, and it goes upside down a lot. The experienced coaster consumer sees it differently, however, understanding how different elements are brought together, all of them offering different flavors and perspectives, but also coming together in harmony to create the perfect symphony. Let's travel back again to Busch Gardens, Tampa, this time taking a look at one of the world's most highly regarded inverted steel coasters. Built in 1996, Montu is well praised for its intensity, whippy elements, and relentless pacing. After traveling up the lift hill, the coaster train descends to the left, pulling riders down a steep drop and into an intense vertical loop. Flying through a tunnel, the train enters an Immelman and exits downwards, banking right and sending riders into a zero-G roll. Giving riders just enough time to recover, the ride vehicle approaches Montu's most iconic element, the Batwing, slamming riders into a trench. After exiting this whippy and discombobulating series of inversions, Montu brings riders into the mid-course brake run for a quick breather, before then diving right into a trench and sending everyone through a second vertical loop. Coming out of the trench, the train quickly moves up an upward helix to the right, then travels down the track before plunging left into another trench, and then sending riders through a corkscrew. Coming up out of the trench, riders are then brought to the brake run preceding the station. It's easy to name elements on a roller coaster, but difficult to really convey their impact through verbal description. However, consensus seems to find that the strong positive G-forces and whippy elements, in conjunction with how they're all arranged to determine the pacing of the coaster, has resulted in an excellent layout. If you only experience roller coasters casually, then perhaps it might be difficult to recognize the artistry of something like Montu. That being said, the roller coasters of today go beyond just the functionality and gimmick of novelty thrills. These twisted masses of steel aren't just feats of engineering, but go beyond that, crafting an intense sensory experience that requires a large degree of nuance through the touch of an artist. I hope that I've established that roller coasters work as a form of art, in both the realms of visual aesthetics and sensory experiences. However, what we have yet to touch on is their ability to convey ideas or even story. If we go back to Leap the Dips, the name of the ride is clearly conveying what the coaster is actually doing. The intention is that you feel as if the coaster is literally leaping over the dips in the track. The same applies with Corkscrew, the name conveying the signature elements of the coaster. However, many coaster names are designed to express an idea in the abstract, allowing the sensory experience of the ride to act as an interpretation for that idea. The Beast at Kings Island has its name reflected in its sheer size and was the tallest, fastest, and longest wooden coaster in the world when it opened in 1979. It still holds the record for longest wooden track at 7,359 feet, allowing it to still be a beast of a roller coaster. There is of course a degree of abstract interpretation as well, as one could imagine that a coaster that travels into the woods such as this, and hugs the terrain while making intense maneuvers, could be interpreted in an impressionistic sense, emulating the movements of an unknown beast through the hills, as conveyed by the sensory experience of the ride course. Here are a few other examples that come to mind. Launching riders at 40 miles an hour into a zero-G roll, plunging them downwards, and then moving into a disorienting, whippy cobra roll, the Incredible Hulk simulates the rage and confusion of the gamma-induced Hulk form that riders are supposed to be experiencing. The incredibly aggressive nature of the coaster conveys the headache-inducing sensation of what it must be like to start hulking out. Another example is Ghost Rider at Knott's Berry Farm, conveying the cowboy spirit in the sky, running from a rag of the devil's horses, a story popularized through many musical iterations. The aggressive nature of the coaster, offering riders a lot of lateral Gs and airtime, could be interpreted as the chase of the legendary cowboy spirit. As coaster types and trains have evolved, new sensations have been used to interpret new ideas. Superman Ultimate Flight is the name of 3 similar but slightly different B&M flying coasters across 3 different Six Flags parks, conveying the sensation of flight. It's pretty obvious why the name was chosen. Another example of the flying coaster is Manta at SeaWorld Orlando, this time with a completely different interpretation. If Superman is conveying the power and speed of the hero it's named after, then Manta conveys the agility and grace of the manta ray as it glides through the ocean. That's not to say that Manta isn't also an intense experience, but the different theme recontextualizes the coaster's elements to convey the powerful but still graceful movements of the manta ray. While we're still in the realm of SeaWorld, let's circle back to the coaster featured in the introduction to this video. Mako is a B&M hypercoaster, naturally framed with the theming of the Mako shark. The coaster brings guests into the role of the shark as it focuses on speed and airtime, interpreting these elements as the movements of a powerful and agile predator. Mako's theme is elevated for me, not just because it's a fantastic coaster, but because the theming of the surrounding area and the queue convey an underwater shipwreck, as if sharks are hunting in this habitat. This interesting interpretation of these elements paints an exciting landscape, and in conjunction with the original score and elements of the track layout, works as the ultimate sensory experience for any roller coaster as achieved thus far. Mako simply works as the best abstract interpretation of a single concept as conveyed by a coaster, at least in my opinion. Now that we've established how the elements and design of a coaster can convey an idea in the impressionistic sense though, it's time to move on to coasters that tie directly into a story or a theme. A roller coaster, when highly themed, falls into one of two categories in how it conveys narrative. The first of these is premise, conveying a simple but single idea that puts riders into their own interpretation of an experience. The other category goes further, relating narrative beats through dialogue and timing the coaster to an actual structured story. Before we get into that though, I think it's essential that we understand the role that the coaster track itself plays in conveying the narrative. In film and television, sound effects or music, when heard by the characters within the reality of the medium, is considered to be diegetic. Non-diegetic sound or music is not heard by the characters, but still plays an important role. For example, laughter in a sitcom is an example of non-diegetic sound, in that it exists solely for the audience, helping to set the mood. The same applies with music, as it wouldn't make sense for the characters in Star Wars to be listening to a John Williams score, but this non-diegetic use of it is essential in conveying mood and pacing. In contrast, diegetic audio exists within the narrative and plays a role by interacting with the characters. What may seem like a score for a scene, conveying mood and pacing in the same way as a non-diegetic piece of music, is also perceived by the characters directly. Why is this important? Well, this same distinction between sound and music can be used with coaster track in conveying narrative. Diegetic track exists within the world of the ride, acting as a component of the theming. For example, Seven Dwarfs Mine Train is quite literally meant to put riders in minecarts and have them travel along mining rails, therefore making the coaster track diegetic, as it exists and makes sense within the theming of the ride. Seven Dwarfs Mine Train also falls into that first narrative category, that it's all premise and no story beats, leading the experience up to the interpretation of the riders. While it is true that the coaster does contain a few show scenes, there is no actual narrative being told. Instead, the premise is that guests are riding throughout German mountains in minecarts, encountering the Seven Dwarfs and eventually Snow White. Another example of the premise coaster with diegetic track would be both Disneyland's and Magic Kingdom's versions of Big Thunder Mountain. While there is a backstory, the ride still exists with the simple premise of Runaway Mine Train. Other similar experiences include Colorado Adventure, another Runaway Mine Train themed roller coaster at Phantasialand, Big Grizzly Mountain Runaway Mine Cars, a spiritual successor to Big Thunder Mountain located at Hong Kong Disneyland, or Black Diamond at Nobles. As you can see, the idea of a Western-themed mine train is a popular one. Black Diamond does stand out a bit more, as the premise is Haunted Mineshaft, differentiating it at least just a little bit. One last example brings us back to the Velocicoaster, where the roller coaster is supposed to be, well, a roller coaster. While the experience does fit narratively into the timeline of the Jurassic World films, I still consider it an experience based around premise because it lacks story beats. It's simply a roller coaster designed to thrill guests by sending them directly through the Raptor paddock. In contrast, two prominent examples come to mind when it comes to storytelling coasters with diegetic track. The first of these is Harry Potter and the Escape from Gringotts, containing clear story beats throughout the duration of the ride experience. The ride also takes advantage of the diegetic track, incorporating the themed minecarts into a tour of the Gringotts vaults. The second example is a little less obvious, but still fits into this category. Expedition Everest tells its story, not through verbal sound cues and characters, but through deduction. The well-detailed theming of the queue conveys your journey through a fictional village, gathering supplies before you board a train that takes you through the Himalayas to reach Mount Everest. However, through the course of your journey, you stop and encounter the mangled railroad. Suddenly, the train plunges backwards into the Forbidden Mountain, where you then encounter the shadow of the Yeti, witnessing it destroy more of the track. In your attempt to escape, the coaster moves through some of its more intense elements, before then escaping the Yeti a final time before returning to the village. While not explicitly stated, the coaster tells the story of your escape, learning about the habitat destruction caused by the railroad and provoking the wrath of the Yeti. To many, it may just seem like a fun and thrilling experience, but to take the time to really notice the details in the queue and to reflect on the events that occur throughout the ride course reveals a level of storytelling that no other coaster has achieved. Like other roller coasters, I would argue that Expedition Everest is a form of art, but it's far more elevated in its use of nuance and theming to convey that story. To quickly wrap this up though, coasters that convey story or theme through non-diegetic track can be found frequently as well. For example, Goofy's Barnstormer conveys the premise of Goofy flying an out-of-control plane through the circus. The track is not meant to be explicitly noticed, instead conveying an interpretation of how Goofy's plane might fly. The track does not play a thematic role in the visuals of the ride, therefore making it non-diegetic. Another example of this would be Space Mountain, where the track is not meant to play a role beyond the space station. If you weren't aware, the premise is rocket through space, conveyed by the strong lateral Gs and sudden dips throughout the ride course. Another coaster that comes to mind is Fire in the Hole at Silver Dollar City. While it may initially appear as a potential mine train style coaster, the Western theme instead has guests take on the role of firefighters, traveling through a number of scenes depicting a gang committing arson. Here, the track is non-diegetic. Another example would be the coaster's spiritual successor, Blazing Fury at Dollywood. Like Fire in the Hole, the premise is that riders take on the role of firefighters, encountering comical scenes as the citizens of this town work to put out the fire. In contrast, I could only find one example of a storytelling coaster with non-diegetic track, with that being Hagrid's Magical Creatures Motorbike Adventure. As with Gringotts, the story is told through dialogue, with guests riding duplicated motorbikes throughout the Forbidden Forest and encountering dangerous magical creatures. Obviously, the track is not intended to be noticed, instead conveying the motion of the out-of-control motorbikes. One really clever use of the non-diegetic track is when the riders get tangled in Double Snare. By using the spell Lumos Solem, the track drops as if the plant is releasing its grip on the vehicles, leading to a startling surprise. As you can see, there are a number of different ways to convey story through the medium of the roller coaster, and there are quite a few examples I didn't even cover. While being aware of different methods of storytelling, or knowing the role that the track plays in conveying the narrative is not necessary to enjoy an attraction for what it is, I did find it interesting how these elements are integrated into the themed experience. I think it serves as the ultimate example of how the coaster can transcend thrill, being utilized as a medium for storytelling and adding new perspective to the roller coaster as an expression of art. The next time you stand in the shadow of twisted steel, make an effort to appreciate it for its qualities beyond just the thrill factor. Rollercoasters act as visual beacons, demanding our attention through their display of power, encouraging us to stare at their awesome structure. The best of them know how to interact with landscapes, putting on a visual spectacle that could only be achieved as an expression of art. Speaking of which, all roller coasters tell a narrative in some way. For many, it's the expertly arranged use of different elements and inversions, conveying narrative in their own unique way through the pull of gravity on the body. Just as a story has its own narrative beats, so too does the roller coaster convey a linear experience, utilizing different sensations to create a satisfying adventure. For many of these structural behemoths, their elements can be interpreted to convey an idea or construct in the abstract, working as an expression of art through twisted structure and kinetic experience. Finally, the roller coaster can be used as a direct method of storytelling, utilizing heavy theming and effects to deliver narrative. Perhaps it might be a case of providing a well-detailed landscape, allowing riders to interpret the experience for their own story. It could also be the case that the attraction offers narrative more directly, providing a different but no less fulfilling interaction. We could approach the roller coaster just seeking thrill. If we did so, however, I think that we would be doing a disservice, not just to ourselves, but to the artists who crafted them. The roller coaster is an extraordinary sensory experience. The roller coaster is art. If you enjoy the video essays that I produce and want to help the channel out, I strongly recommend hitting the like button to help boost the video into the YouTube algorithm. If you want to see more and haven't yet subscribed, I encourage you to do that as well, so as to be notified when new videos are released.